The first thing anyone noticed was the water. It was February of 2013, in a 14-story hotel on Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. An old building wearing a new name, Stay on Main, like a fresh coat of paint over something that refused to stay covered. Guests started complaining the way guests do. The shower pressure had gone weak, barely a trickle on the upper floors. The water ran dark for a second or two before it cleared. And the taste, people kept mentioning the taste. Sweet, somehow, wrong. One couple would later say they'd been drinking it, brushing their teeth with it, washing their faces in it for days. Nobody panicked. It was a 90-year-old building on the edge of Skid Row. Old pipes. Old everything. You expect a building like that to have bad blood in its veins. On the morning of February 19th, a maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez took the elevator to the top floor, climbed the last stretch to the roof, and walked out to the 4 industrial water tanks that fed the building. He climbed the side of one of them and looked down through the hatch into the dark water below. And in that moment, a missing person case that had already gone viral around the world stopped being a mystery people were trying to solve and became something people would never stop trying to explain. Because down in the lobby, taped near the front desk, there was a flyer, a photograph of a smiling young woman in glasses, 21 years old, missing almost 3 weeks. Her name was Elisa Lam. I need to be honest with you about something before I go any further. I watched the elevator video before they found her. Millions of us did. It was released while she was still just a missing girl, and we all told ourselves we were helping. Studying the footage, freezing the frames, posting our theories at 3 in the morning. I want you to remember that as I tell you this story, because the strangest part of the Elisa Lam case isn't just what happened inside the Cecil Hotel. It's what happened inside all of us who watched. Elisa Lam was from Vancouver, Canada, the daughter of immigrants from Hong Kong who ran a small restaurant. She was a student at the University of British Columbia. She loved books the way some people love people. She kept a blog where she wrote about fashion, about novels, about feeling lost sometimes, about trying to be okay. The kind of honest, rambling, late-night writing that half the internet was doing in 2013. She was open on that blog about living with bipolar disorder and about the work it took to manage it. In late January, she set out alone on what she called her West Coast tour, riding Amtrak down the coast, seeing San Diego, posting photos from the zoo, planning to head north again toward Santa Cruz. Just a girl on a trip, just a person, 3 weeks from turning invisible. Her stop in Los Angeles brought her to the Cecil. You have to understand what the Cecil Hotel is, because in this story, the building is not the setting. The building is a character. It opened in the mid-1920s as a grand hotel for traveling businessmen. 700 rooms, a marble lobby, stained glass, palm trees in brass pots. Within a few years, the Great Depression gutted the neighborhood, and the streets around the Cecil slowly transformed into Skid Row, one of the largest concentrations of homelessness in America. The hotel sank with the neighborhood. The businessmen left. The rooms went cheap, then cheaper. It became a place for transients, for long-term residents with nowhere else to go, for people the city had stopped looking at, and the deaths began to pile up. Across the decades, the Cecil saw so many suicides and overdoses and violent ends that people who lived nearby gave it a nickname. I won't dress up. They called it the Cecil, the way you'd say the name of a person you didn't trust. In 1964, a retired telephone operator known as Pigeon Goldie Osgood, a beloved fixture who fed the birds in the park across the street, was found murdered in her room. Her killing was never solved. In 1985, During the summer, Los Angeles was hunted by the serial killer they called the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez was living on the Cecil's upper floors for $14 a night, walking home through those hallways while the whole city locked its windows against him. 6 years later, an Austrian journalist named Jack Unterweger checked in. He was writing about crime in Los Angeles. He was also committing it. He was later convicted of murdering women in 3 countries, and investigators believe he chose the Cecil deliberately because of Ramirez. Think about that. The building had developed a gravity. It was pulling things toward it. That is the hotel Elisa Lam walked into at the end of January 2013 with her glasses and her red hoodie and her suitcase of books. She was there several days. She was placed first in a shared room, hostel style, and was later moved to a room of her own, after other guests raised concerns about her behavior. Details I'll leave alone, because she deserves that. What matters is this. On January 31st, she was seen at the Last Bookstore, a famous shop a few blocks away. The manager remembered her clearly. She was warm, chatty, buying books and gifts to bring home to her family in Vancouver. Gifts she was going to give them. That is the last confirmed time anyone saw Elisa Lam outside the walls of the Cecil Hotel. Then she simply stopped posting, stopped calling her parents, who she'd been checking in with every single day of the trip. The silence was immediate and total, and her family knew, the way families always know, that something was wrong. They flew to Los Angeles. The LAPD searched the hotel, floor by floor. Police dogs went through the building and even up onto the roof. They found nothing. And then, on February 14th, hoping the public could help, the police released the video. I remember exactly where I was when I first watched it. You may remember too. It is 4 minutes of grainy elevator surveillance footage, and it is one of the most unsettling pieces of video the internet has ever passed from hand to hand. She steps into the elevator alone, in that red hoodie, and presses a column of buttons. Not one floor, many floors, her finger walking down the panel. Then she waits. The doors do not close. She steps toward them and leans her head out into the hallway, looking one way, then the other, like someone checking whether they've been followed. She pulls back inside and presses herself into the corner beside the control panel. The one blind spot, the place you'd stand if you didn't want to be seen from the hall. The doors still do not close. She steps out entirely. She steps back in. At one point, she stands in the open doorway, and her hands begin to move. Strange, fluid gestures. Fingers spread as if she's explaining something to someone, or counting something, or pushing something away. There is no one visible. Then she walks out of frame, to the left, into the hallway, and the doors, which refused to close for the entire time she was inside, slide gently shut behind her. The video detonated online. Millions of views within days. It was subtitled and reposted across the world. In China alone, it spread so fast that news outlets covered the phenomenon itself. Entire forums dedicated themselves to it. People slowed it down, frame by frame. They noticed the timestamp in the corner appeared distorted, and argued the footage had been slowed, that a chunk of time was unaccounted for, that someone had edited it before release. Was she hiding from a person just out of frame? Was she playing some kind of game? Was the elevator broken or held? I sat up at night, refreshing those threads like it was my job. We all felt like detectives. She was still missing, and it felt like the whole internet was looking for her. 5 days after the video was released, the guests started complaining about the water. The roof of the Cecil was supposed to be inaccessible. The door was locked and wired with an alarm, but the fire escapes ran up the outside of the building, and the alarm question was never fully put to rest. There was one more discrepancy that theorists have never let go of. The maintenance worker testified that when he climbed the tank, the hatch was open, while early reports had suggested it was closed. A closed hatch would have been very difficult to explain, an open one, less so. But by then, the case had already left the realm of facts. It belonged to the internet now. The autopsy took months. When it came, the finding was accidental drowning, with her bipolar disorder listed as a significant condition. The toxicology results indicated she had not been taking her full prescribed medication in the days before her death. Her family confirmed she had experienced severe episodes before, ones where she lost her grip on what was real. Doctors who reviewed the case later said the behavior in that elevator was consistent with someone suffering a psychotic episode, someone terrified of things that were not there, in a building that was, for once, exactly as frightening as it looked. Read plainly, the most likely explanation was also the saddest one. A young woman far from home, in medical crisis, alone, in the worst possible building in Los Angeles to be alone in. No monster, no killer. Just a person who needed help, in a place with a long history of people who needed help and never got it. But the internet does not do well with sad, plain explanations. Patterns are comforting. Randomness is not. So the theories bloomed. People discovered a Korean and Japanese urban legend called the elevator game, a ritual where you press a specific sequence of floors, alone, to travel to another world, and laid her button pressing over it, like tracing paper. People noticed that a 2005 horror film called Dark Water tells the story of a body in a rooftop water tank contaminating a building's supply. A film released 8 years before, mirroring the case in ways that feel impossible when you first hear them. And then there was the one that made even skeptics go quiet for a second. In the weeks around her death, a tuberculosis outbreak hit Skid Row right outside the hotel's doors. The diagnostic test used for that strain of TB is called Lam Elisa. Her name, waiting inside a lab acronym. It means nothing. It has to mean nothing. But I remember reading it for the first time and feeling the floor of the rational world tilt just slightly under my feet. The Cecil never recovered from the story. The rebrand failed to outrun the name. The building closed its doors in 2017, sat dark for years over Main Street, and eventually reopened as low-income housing. Hundreds of small rooms for people the city had stopped looking at, which, if you think about it, is the only ending the Cecil was ever going to have. In 2021, a Netflix documentary series dragged the whole case back into the light and forced a lot of us to look at what we'd participated in. The amateur detectives who had harassed innocent people, the millions of us who had turned a young woman's final days into content. And here is the detail that has never let go of me. Elisa's blog didn't stop when she did. She had queued her posts in advance, the way bloggers do. And so for weeks after February 19th, her blog kept updating. Quotes she'd loved, images she'd saved, little scheduled pieces of her arriving on time from someone who no longer existed. People watched her page like a seance. New post, new post. A ghost made of drafts. I don't believe the Cecil Hotel is haunted. I believe something worse. I believe it's the kind of place that shows you, with the lights fully on, exactly how easy it is for a person to slip through the world's fingers. How a smiling girl buying gifts for her family on a Thursday can be gone by the weekend, 20 feet above the room where strangers slept, while the whole building drank and washed and brushed its teeth, day after day, and noticed nothing at all, except that the water tasted strange. Sometimes, late at night, I still catch myself watching the video. I'm not looking for clues anymore. I know how it ends. I watch her lean out into that empty hallway, checking left, checking right, hiding from something only she could see. And I catch myself hoping, every single time, that this time will be different. That this time she'll press one button and ride down to the lobby and walk out into the daylight on Main Street. And every time she steps out of frame and the doors just close. My wife and I bought our first house 3 summers ago. It's nothing special. A small place with a crooked porch step and a maple tree that drops its leaves into the gutters every October. But I remember the day we got the keys, standing in the empty living room, listening to the particular silence a house makes when it's yours. People tell you a lot of things about owning a home. What they don't tell you is that from that day forward, a little piece of your mind will always live in the mailbox. I know that sounds strange. Stay with me. Because I need to tell you about a family in New Jersey and a house on a street called the Boulevard, and the letters that started arriving 3 days after they signed the papers. I've read everything ever published about this case, and I'm telling you now, it has changed the way I open my own mail. Westfield, New Jersey is the kind of town they put on the cover of real estate brochures. Old trees arching over wide streets, kids on bikes, train station to Manhattan, coffee shops downtown, one of the lowest crime rates in the state. It's the kind of place people work their whole lives to afford, because nothing bad is supposed to happen there. And on one of its prettiest streets stood the house at 657 Boulevard. A big, handsome home built in 1905, 6 bedrooms, a wide porch, the kind of house that looks like it should have a golden retriever sleeping on the steps. In the spring of 2014, a couple named Derek and Maria Broadus decided it was the one. They weren't strangers chasing a fantasy. Maria had grown up in Westfield, just blocks away. Derek had come up from a working-class childhood and spent 20 years climbing to a senior job at an insurance firm in the city. 3 kids, all under 10. The house cost them $1, $35 million. Essentially everything they had built. And when they closed the deal that June, it must have felt like the finish line of their entire lives. They didn't move in right away. There was painting to do, renovations, contractors coming and going. Derek would drive over in the evenings after work to get the place ready for his family. 3 nights after the closing, he was there alone, rolling paint onto the walls of his new home, when he went out to check the mailbox. Inside was a single white envelope, thick cardstock, addressed in heavy handwritten print to the new owner. No return address. He opened it standing in the dark, in a house with no curtains, on a street he didn't know yet. The letter welcomed him to the neighborhood. And then, within a few sentences, it stopped being a welcome. The writer explained that 657 Boulevard had been the subject of their family for decades, that their grandfather had watched the house in the 1920s, that their father had watched it in the 1960s, and that now the watching had passed to them. The writer asked how the Broaduses had come to the house, whether it had called to them, whether they had been brought there by greed, or whether they had brought the writer what he had asked for. Because the writer had seen the moving trucks, had seen the children. The letter asked, in words I still can't read, without my stomach dropping, whether they had filled the house with the young blood he had requested. It was signed simply, The Watcher. Derek Broadus stood in his empty dream home at 10 o'clock at night, a paint roller drying in the tray behind him, and read that letter about his children. Then he looked up, at the big, bare windows all around him, at the dark houses across the street, at the black gaps between the trees, and understood, in a single cold moment, that he could not see anyone. But if the letter was telling the truth, someone could see him. He called the police that night. An officer came, read the letter, and asked him a question that would echo for years. Did he have any enemies? He didn't. They'd been owners of the house for 72 hours. The second letter came about 2 weeks later. This time it was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Broadus, the name slightly misspelled, as if heard rather than read. And this one proved something the first had only implied. The watcher was close. The writer knew the renovations that were underway, knew about the contractors, and, worst of all, knew the children. Not just that there were 3 of them. The letter used their nicknames. The private, family nicknames the kids called each other in the yard. The writer had learned their names by listening to them play, and mused about which of the bedrooms they would sleep in. And then the letter asked a question that has since become infamous. The writer wanted to know whether the family had discovered what was hidden within the walls of the house, and promised that, in time, they would. Maria stopped sleeping. They had been days from moving in. Now she refused to let the children set foot in the house. Think about the position they were in. Every dollar they had was buried in that property, plus the mortgage, plus the home they still lived in across town. They couldn't tell their friends. How do you explain something like this at a barbecue without sounding paranoid, or worse, cursed? They told almost no one. They installed cameras and floodlights. They hired private investigators, and eventually a former FBI profiler, and the county prosecutor's office opened its own file. Meanwhile, Derek was quietly coming apart. He described it himself years later. The panic attacks, sitting in church unable to breathe, lying awake cataloging every neighbor, every wave hello, every parked car. When the third letter arrived weeks later, its tone had changed. The watcher had noticed the house was still empty. The writer wanted to know where they had gone. The house, the letter said, was missing them. And then came the detail that turned fear into fury. When the Broaduses reached out to the previous owners, a couple who had raised their family at 657 Boulevard for 23 peaceful years, the truth surfaced. Days before moving out, the old owners had received a letter from the watcher. Same signature, same fixation on the house. They had thought it was a one-off oddity, and they had never said a word. The Broaduses sued them for it, and when the lawsuit hit the court records in 2015, the secret they had guarded so carefully detonated in public. News vans on the boulevard, reporters on lawns. The whole country suddenly knew about the Watcher House. And inside that pretty town, something curdled. Because everyone understood what the letters meant. Whoever wrote them wasn't some drifter passing through. The Watcher knew the contractor's schedules, the children's nicknames, the history of the street. The Watcher was local. The Watcher, in all likelihood, was a neighbor. Someone who mowed their lawn. Someone who waved. The investigation went places you'd expect and places you wouldn't. Police looked hard at an aging man who had lived beside the house nearly his whole life. A strange, quiet fixture of the street. His family insisted he was harmless, and he was never charged with anything. Investigators tested a DNA sample recovered from one of the envelopes and got a result that only deepened the mystery. The DNA belonged to a woman. It matched no one. Not the neighbors they checked, not anyone in the system. Handwriting analysis went nowhere. A theory floated that the letters were meant to scare the family off so someone could stop development or buy the place cheap. Nothing held. And then the internet did what the internet does. When the case exploded again in 2018, a magazine writer had spent months with the family and published the whole saga. Armchair detectives decided the simplest answer was the cruelest one, that Derek and Maria had written the letters themselves. hoax for money. Never mind that investigators had scrutinized them from the start and found nothing. Never mind what the ordeal had visibly done to them. To this day, if you read about this case online, you will find strangers casually accusing a family of terrorizing their own children. That's the part of this story nobody warns you about. The Watcher only had to write 4 letters. The world handled the rest because here is the trap they were in. They couldn't live in the house and they couldn't get rid of it. When they tried to sell in 2016, buyers loved it. Right up until the legally required moment the letters were disclosed. And then every single one of them walked. The Broadises grew desperate enough to propose tearing the house down entirely, demolishing their own $1 million home and splitting the lot into 2. And in January 2017, they went before the town planning board to ask permission. The meeting was packed. Their neighbors, the same community that knew exactly what this family had been through, stood up one after another and objected. The lot split didn't conform to the neighborhood's character, they said. The board voted no. The town would not let them leave, so they rented it out, found a family willing to live there, fully informed, in exchange for cheap rent. And within weeks of the lights coming back on at 657 Boulevard, in February of 2017, a 4th letter arrived. It was the angriest one yet. The writer seethed about the family's attempt to destroy the house, spoke of grievances and vengeance, of sleepless anger, of consequences. 3 years had passed since the first letter. Whoever the Watcher was, they were still there. Still checking the mailbox, still watching the windows. The renters, to their credit, stayed. The letters after that stopped, or at least no more were ever made public. In July of 2019, 5 years after they bought their dream home, Derek and Maria Broadis finally sold 657 Boulevard for $959,000. Hundreds of thousands less than they'd paid, to say nothing of 5 years of taxes and mortgage payments on a house they never spent a single night in. A new family lives there now. Publicly, at least, they have never received a letter. In 2022, a streaming series turned the whole thing into glossy fiction. Invented characters, invented endings, secret tunnels, all of it. And millions of people came away thinking they knew this story. But the real ending is quieter and so much worse. There is no ending. No arrest was ever made. No confession. No name. The DNA of an unknown woman sits in a file somewhere, matching no one. The case is, as far as anyone knows, still open and still cold. I think about the Broadises more than I'd like to admit. Not the money, though the money is its own kind of horror. I think about what was actually stolen from them, which is something you can't sue to recover. The ability to stand in your own kitchen, in your own town, and feel unobserved. Derek said once that the experience rewired him, that he doesn't trust the way he used to, that he watches people now, studies them the way someone once studied him. The Watcher never broke a window, never crossed the property line, as far as anyone can prove. All they ever did was pay attention, obsessively, patiently, for years, and put that attention on paper. It turns out that's enough. That's all it takes to hollow out a family. And there's one more thing, the thing I can't put down. Whoever wrote those letters was almost certainly still there when the news vans left. Still there when the board voted. Still there when the new family moved in and the story faded, and the street went back to being beautiful. Statistically, they are probably there right now. Older, quieter, taking out the trash on the same morning as everyone else, wearing the ordinary face they have worn this entire time. Somebody in that town holds this secret behind their storm door, and has held it for over a decade without cracking. That kind of patience frightens me more than any figure in any window ever could. So yes, 3 summers into owning my own home, I still pause at the mailbox. Every once in a while, there's an envelope with no return address. And for 1 second, before I open it, I stand there on my crooked porch step and I feel it. The possibility that somewhere out there, someone has noticed us, has learned our names, our hours, the sound of our door. It's always a flyer, a charity ask, a neighbor's misdelivered bill. I laugh at myself, mostly. But I'd be lying if I told you I don't glance up afterward, just once, at the quiet houses across the street, at the dark spaces between the trees, checking for something I know I wouldn't be able to see anyway. Because that's what 657 Boulevard taught me. You never actually know who's watching. You only know when they decide to tell you. I was 9 years old the first time I saw the house with the eyes. It was at a sleepover on a worn-out VHS tape someone's older brother left behind. That poster image of a dark Dutch colonial with 2 glowing quarter-moon windows under the roof, staring out at the street like something that had just noticed you. I didn't sleep that night. For years afterward, I thought it was just a movie. A story someone invented to sell popcorn. Then I got older, and I learned the truth, which is that the house is real. It stands on a quiet street on Long Island, an hour from Manhattan, and people live in it right now. And the real story of what happened inside it is stranger, sadder, and in one specific way, far more frightening than anything the movies ever showed. Because the movies gave us demons. The truth gives us a question nobody has ever been able to answer. Amityville is a small village on the south shore of Long Island. Canals and boat docks, clam bars, flags on porches. The kind of town where the loudest thing on most nights is the water slapping against hulls. Ocean Avenue runs down toward the river, lined with big old houses, and in 1974, the grandest of them was number 112. 3 stories, a swimming pool, its own boathouse on the canal, and a little sign posted by the door with the name the family had given the place. The sign read, High Hopes. The family behind that sign was the DeFeos. Ronald DeFeo Sr. ran the service department at his father-in-law's Buick dealership in Brooklyn. A heavyset, loud, devoutly Catholic man with a shrine in the yard, and by every account that mattered, a violent temper inside the walls. His wife Louise kept the house and the peace. When peace could be kept, there were 5 children, and the eldest was Ronald Jr. Everyone called him Butch. 23 years old, still living at home, drifting through a fog of heroin and speed, feuding constantly with the father who had hit him for years. The family bought his silence and his smiles the way wealthy families sometimes do. Money, a car, a job at the dealership he barely showed up for. From the street, High Hopes looked like the American dream. Behind the door, it was a pressure cooker with the lid screwed down. In the earliest hours of November 13, 1974, somewhere around 3 in the morning, someone moved through that house with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. Room to room, floor to floor. When it was over, 6 people were dead. Ronald Sr. and Louise in their bedroom, Dawn, who was 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and John, who was 9 years old. Every single one of them was found in bed, lying face down, as if the night had simply continued around them. And here is where the story stops behaving like other stories. That rifle had no silencer. A Marlin like that produces a blast you feel in your chest, and it was fired again and again in a wooden house on a quiet street. Yet no neighbor called the police. The only sound anyone later recalled was a dog barking somewhere in the dark. Inside the house, none of the 6 appeared to have gotten up. Nobody ran. Nobody hid in a closet or reached for a phone. 6 people, 5 separate rooms, and not one of them seems to have been stopped in the act of fleeing. When the medical examiners ran toxicology, looking for the obvious answer, they found it wasn't there. No sedatives. Nothing to explain the stillness. 50 years later, there still isn't. That evening, around 6:30, the door of a local bar called Henry's banged open, and Butch DeFeo stumbled in, screaming that someone had shot his mother and father. A handful of men followed him back down Ocean Avenue and walked into the silence of that house, and within hours, Amityville was full of police. Butch had a story ready. A mob enforcer he knew had a grudge against the family. A hit, he said, and he'd been lucky to be out of the house. The detectives listened and put him up somewhere safe and kept him talking. His story sagged, then cracked, then fell apart entirely. Within a day, Butch DeFeo confessed to murdering his whole family, telling investigators in essence that once it began, it went fast, and he simply hadn't been able to stop. At trial the following year, his lawyer, a man named William Weber, remember that name, mounted an insanity defense, and this is where the legend of the house was born. Butch claimed he heard voices, the family plotting against him, whispers in the house pushing him on. A defense psychiatrist called it psychosis. The prosecution's expert called it something colder. An antisocial young man, fully aware, dressing up rage and greed as madness. There was family insurance money in play. The jury took the second view. In November 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life for each. He spent the next 4.5 decades in prison, changing his story like weather. The mob did it. An intruder did it. His sister Dawn did it. He did it, but not alone. And he died there in March of 2021 without ever settling on a single truth. The courts knew who. To this day, nobody can fully explain the quiet. 13 months after the murders, in December 1975, a young couple stood in that house with a realtor and made a decision. George and Kathy Lutz were newlyweds. She had 3 kids from her first marriage, ages 9, 7, and 5. And 112 Ocean Avenue was the kind of property people like them were never supposed to afford. It was listed at $80,000, a fraction of its worth, and they knew exactly why. The realtor told them straight. They talked it over and landed where most practical people would. A house is wood and plaster. It doesn't keep what happened in it. They signed. And because they were starting out and money was tight, they paid roughly $400 extra for the furniture the DeFeos had left behind. The tables, the dressers, the beds. The family moved in on December 18th. Their children slept that first night, and every night after, in the bedrooms. On moving day, a priest the family knew came to bless the house. He worked room to room with holy water, and in a small second-floor room the DeFeos had used for sewing, he later claimed something happened that he would repeat, in varying forms, for the rest of his life. A deep voice, close behind him, in an empty room, telling him to get out. He left shaken, and, by his account, tried more than once to warn the family away from that room. There was something else about that room. In the dead of a Long Island December, with frost on the windows, it kept filling with flies. Fat, sluggish houseflies, dozens of them, appearing no matter how many were killed, in a month when there should have been none at all. What follows is what George and Kathy Lutz swore to, on tape, in interviews, and to the end of their lives. George began waking every night, without alarm or reason, at almost the same minute. Around 3:15 in the morning, the approximate hour he would later learn, the DeFeos died. He couldn't get warm. He stopped going to work, spent his days chopping wood and feeding a fire that never seemed to heat the house. Kathy dreamed of the murders in detail she felt she shouldn't have known, and woke feeling things touch her that were not there. a greenish-black ooze seeped from keyholes and walls, and 5-year-old Missy acquired a new imaginary friend she talked to by the window. She called it Jody, and described it as a pig. One night George looked up at Missy's window from the yard and swore he saw 2 red eyes looking back. In the morning, in the snow outside, they found tracks, cloven like a hoofed animal that had stood there on 2 legs. Down in the basement, behind shelving, they discovered a tiny closet painted entirely red, a space that appeared on no floor plan they were shown. The family dog, who feared nothing, would not go near it. They lasted 28 days. On the night of January 13th, 1976, something happened in that house that George and Kathy would spend the rest of their lives refusing to fully describe. Both of them said, in interview after interview, that the last night was the worst, and that they would not talk about all of it. What is certain is this. On January 14th, the Lutz family got in their van and drove to Kathy's mother's house, and they never spent another night at 112 Ocean Avenue. They left their furniture, they left their clothes in the closets and food in the kitchen. Movers retrieved it later. Within weeks, the story leaked, news crews arrived, and a televised séance was held in the house, featuring the era's most famous demon hunters, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Out of that circus came, years later, the case's most famous artifact, a photograph taken inside the empty house that night, showing what appears to be a small boy with glowing eyes peering from a doorway. Believers call it the Ghost Boy. Skeptics point out it looks a great deal like one of the investigators who was present. It is, either way, one of the creepiest photographs ever taken in an American home. In 1977, a writer named Jay Anson turned the Lutz's tape-recorded account into a book, The Amityville Horror, with the words "A True Story" printed on the cover. It sold in the millions. 2 years later came the film, and that poster and the eye-shaped windows burned into the nightmares of kids like me at sleepovers across the world. The franchise never stopped. There have been dozens of Amityville movies since, because it turns out you can't own the name of a town. And then, piece by piece, the true story started coming apart in public. William Weber, Butch DeFeo's own defense lawyer, admitted that he had met with George and Kathy and helped shape the haunting narrative, saying the tale was created over many bottles of wine. A possessed house, after all, could mean a new trial for his client and a payday for everyone. Researchers pulled the weather records. On the night, the Lutzes said, they found cloven hoofprints in the snow. There had been no snow. The book described doors torn from hinges and locks wrenched apart. The next owners found the original hardware intact, unscarred, never replaced. The book claimed the land had once been a site where the local Shinnecock people abandoned their sick and dying. A detail flatly rejected by historians and by the Shinnecock Nation itself. Judges wading through the lawsuits that followed openly described the book as fiction. And the Cromarty family, who bought the house in 1977 for $55,000, lived there almost a decade and reported that absolutely nothing supernatural ever happened. The only things haunting them were tourists, headlights crawling past at 3 a.m., strangers on the lawn, drunks ringing the bell, asking to see the Red Room, people carving chunks out of the yard for souvenirs. It got so bad the village let them change the house number. Later owners went further and replaced the famous quarter-moon windows. They put out the eyes, so the house could stop being recognized by its own legend. But before you file the whole thing under hoax, sit with the other side of the ledger, because it doesn't fold as easily as you'd think. George and Kathy Lutz never recanted, not through their divorce years later, not when the money stopped, not on their deathbeds. Kathy died in 2004, George in 2006, and both insisted to the end that the core of it was true. In 1979, they reportedly sat for polygraph examinations arranged by professional examiners and passed. And then there are the children. In 2013, Daniel Lutz, the 9-year-old boy from that house, now a gray, weathered man, sat for a documentary and told his version, that it happened, that it was worse than the book, and that he blames his stepfather George, who he claims dabbled in things he shouldn't have. You can watch that film and decide he's describing demons, or decide he's describing a frightening stepfather and a childhood deformed by 28 days of chaos and 40 years of infamy. What you cannot easily decide is that the man is acting. Whatever was or wasn't in that house, it followed those kids out of it. I drove down Ocean Avenue once, years ago, telling myself it was on the way to somewhere else. The number on the house is different now. The eye windows are gone. It's just a big, beautiful home on a canal, a kayak by the water, somebody's garden hose coiled by the steps, where every family since 1977 has slept soundly. I sat there with the engine idling for about 10 seconds before the shame caught up with me, and I drove on. If you ever get the urge, let me save you the trip. The only documented haunting at that address in the last 50 years has been us, the readers, the viewers, the ones who keep coming back. And yet, strip away the slime and the flies and Jody the pig, throw out every word the Lutzes ever said, burn the book, and you are still left standing in the dark of November 13th, 1974, with the only part of this story no one has ever explained. A rifle with no silencer, fired again and again in a wooden house on a sleeping street. 6 people in 5 rooms, not one of them out of bed, not one neighbor at a window. No sedatives in their blood, no answer in 50 years of asking. There are only 2 possibilities, and I've turned them over more nights than I'd like to admit. Either something in that house pressed down on that family and held the whole street asleep while it happened, or nothing was there at all. And the silence just happened, the way terrible things sometimes simply happen, with no force behind them and no meaning underneath. I was 9 when the demons kept me up at night. I'm a grown man now, and I'll be honest with you, it's the second one that does. Some nights I still snap awake in the small hours. No alarm, no reason, the house dead quiet around me, and I lie there telling myself it's nothing, and I believe it. Almost. My great-grandmother was 7 years old in the spring of 1919, living in a narrow shotgun house in New Orleans, and until the day she died, she told the same story at every family gathering. Always in the same words, always at the same slow pace. The way people tell stories they are still half inside of. She told us about the night the entire city stayed up until dawn playing music. Every house, every porch, every dance hall. Horns and banjos and out-of-tune pianos, all of it pouring out of open windows into the dark at once. And her father standing in the doorway, with his hand on an old shotgun, watching the street. When I was a boy, I thought it was a fairy tale, something sweet she'd invented about the old days. Then I grew up, and one night I finally looked it up. Everything she said was true, beneath it. And the reason behind that beautiful night of music is one of the most frightening true stories in American history. You have to picture New Orleans in 1918 to understand it. The Great War was ending overseas, and the influenza was creeping through the wards. The streets were gaslit and humid, and on nearly every corner stood a little family grocery, most of them run by Italian immigrants who lived in the rooms behind their own shops. Husband, wife, children, all sleeping a few feet from the cash register, doors bolted, windows latched. They were careful people. They had come across an ocean to build small, orderly lives, and they locked up every night like everyone else. The thing that came for them did not care about locks, because the thing that came for them did not use the door the way a man uses a door. His method never changed, and it is the detail that still gets under my skin a century later. In the smallest hours of the night, he would kneel at the back door of a grocery and go to work on the lower wooden panel with a chisel, patiently, quietly, shaving it loose, sliver by sliver. A job that must have taken a long time, done in total darkness, close enough to hear the family breathing on the other side of the wall. He never smashed anything. He carved himself an opening the size of a dog door and slipped through it into the sleeping house. He almost never brought a weapon. He didn't need to. He would find the family's own axe, the one they kept by the woodpile or the shed, and carry it inside. And when it was over, he would set it down, in the yard or on the step, and dissolve back into the dark. The newspapers would soon give him the only name he ever had. They called him the Axeman. It began in May of 1918, with a grocer named Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine, who ran a corner store at Upperline and Magnolia, and slept in the room behind it. Joseph's brothers lived on the other side of a thin wall, and just before 5 in the morning, they woke to strange sounds and pounded on the connecting door. What they found in that bedroom, I will not describe in detail. It is enough to say that Joseph and Catherine had been attacked in their bed as they slept, with an axe and a straight razor, and neither survived the morning. The razor belonged to one of the brothers, Andrew, and for a few ugly days, the police held him for it before letting him go. The first innocent man this case would chew on, but not the last. The lower panel of the back door had been neatly chiseled out, and a block away someone found a message scrawled in chalk on a fence, taunting and strange, saying that Mrs. Maggio was going to sit up that night, just like a Mrs. Tony before her. Older police officers went pale at that. Years earlier, before the war, there had been a string of unsolved nighttime attacks on Italian grocers and their wives. Whoever wrote that chalk was telling the city something. I'm not new at this. I've been here before. A month later, he came through the door panel of a grocery on Dorjanowa Street, where a Polish grocer named Louis Bessemer lived with a woman named Harriet Lowe. Both were struck down. Both, at first, survived. And here the case curdled into farce, because it was 1918, and the country was drunk on war paranoia. When Harriet, gravely injured and confused, muttered accusations, the papers decided Bessemer might be a German spy, and when she died weeks later, the state charged him with her murder. He sat in a cell for the better part of a year. When his trial finally came, the jury needed all of 10 minutes to acquit him. The Axeman had a talent that went beyond violence. He ruined people he never even touched. That August, he changed. On the 5th, a 28-year-old woman named Anna Schneider woke in the night to find a shape standing over her bed. Anna was 8 months pregnant. Her husband came home from work to find her beaten nearly beyond recognition. And here is the one small mercy in this whole story. Anna lived, and days later she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. 5 nights after Anna, it was an elderly man named Joseph Romano who lived with his 2 teenage nieces. The girls woke to sounds from his room and reached his doorway in time to actually see it. A big man, heavy-set, in a dark suit and a dark slouch hat, pulled low, standing in their home. They would tell police. He seemed to vanish rather than run. That for a man his size, he moved with an impossible, floating lightness, like something that weighed nothing at all. Their uncle staggered out of his room, said he'd been struck, and died 2 days later. The chiseled panel. The family's own axe dropped in the yard. By now, the whole city knew the signature by heart, and New Orleans lost its mind. That autumn, Men sat up in shifts with shotguns across their knees. Families dragged mattresses into a single room and slept in a pile, taking turns keeping watch. People found axes lying in their yards at dawn, or chisel marks half-finished on their door panels, and understood that he had been there, inches away, and had simply, for his own reasons, moved on. Police were flooded with reports of shadows and footsteps. Grown men fired into their own gardens at nothing. Then winter came, and the war ended, and the flu burned through, and the attacks just stopped. For months, nothing. The city exhaled and told itself it was over. It was not over. On the night of March 10, 1919, across the river in Gretna, he chiseled his way into the home of a grocer named Charles Cortimiglia, who lived with his wife Rosie and their daughter Mary. Mary was 2 years old. Rosie woke to the nightmare and snatched her baby up and held her, and the axeman brought the axe down anyway. Charles and Rosie were both grievously wounded, and both survived. Mary did not. I have read a great many terrible things researching these stories, and I will tell you plainly, the death of Mary Cortimiglia, in her mother's arms, is the cruelest fact in this entire case. And what happened next is the second cruelest. Rosie, shattered, grieving, her skull fractured, told police she had recognized the attackers, their neighbors and business rivals, an old man named Orlando Giordano and his teenage son Frank. Her own husband said it wasn't true, said it couldn't be true, it didn't matter. That May, a jury convicted them both. The old man got life. Frank, an 18-year-old boy, was sentenced to hang. They were innocent. It would take until the end of 1920 for Rosie, sick, ruined, abandoned, to walk into a newspaper office and confess that she had lied, that grief and spite had put those names in her mouth. The Giordanos walked free. The axeman's true body count has to include the lives he destroyed without ever raising the axe. 3 days after the Cortimiglia attack, while the city was at full boil, the letter arrived at the Times-Picayune. It was datelined not from any street or parish, but from hell itself, and the newspaper printed it. The writer claimed he was no man at all, a spirit, a demon of the hottest depths, invisible, able to stand at any bedside in the city whenever he pleased. He sneered at the police as fools. He wrote, in the line every New Orleanian would be quoting by nightfall, "They have never caught me, and they never will." And then this creature, whoever he really was, made the strangest bargain in the history of American crime. He announced that he would pass over the city at 15 minutes past midnight on the night of March 19th, and that he would spare every home in which a jazz band was, at that moment, in full swing. Music, he was saying. Play music, and you live. You already know what my great-grandmother saw, because a 7-year-old girl standing in a doorway saw the same thing the whole world's newspapers reported. March 19th, St. Joseph's Night, of all nights, a feast day sacred to the very Italian families he had been butchering, became the loudest night New Orleans has ever known. The dance halls were jammed past their walls. Families who had never hired a musician in their lives paid cornet players to stand in their parlors. Phonographs were hauled to open windows and turned toward the street. Banjos on porches, church pianos, kids on pots and pans, 10,000 parties thrown as ransom, the whole delirious city howling ragtime into the dark to buy its own life. A local composer even rushed out sheet music to cash in, a tune called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, and people actually gathered around pianos and played it, a song about the monster, performed to appease the monster. And when the sun came up on March 20th, the newspapers confirmed the miracle. Not one attack, not one door panel touched. In the entire city, nobody had died. Now, was the letter even real? I should be honest with you. Because the truth here is somehow stranger than the legend. Many historians who have studied this case believe the Axeman never wrote that letter at all, that it was a prank, maybe by some newspaperman or some macabre joker riding the panic. Think about what that means. It means an entire American city may have thrown the greatest party in its history to satisfy a demon that existed only in a hoaxer's imagination, while the real killer, the flesh and blood one, sat somewhere inside that wall of music, listening. I genuinely don't know which version frightens me more, because he wasn't finished. That August, a grocer named Steve Boca stumbled bleeding into a friend's house with no memory of the attack. His door panel was chiseled, the axe left behind. In September, a 19-year-old girl named Sarah Lauman was attacked in her own bed and survived. And on the night of October 27, 1919, the axeman carved his way into the home of a grocer named Mike Pepitone, a father of 6, and killed him in his bed. Pepitone's wife reached the doorway in time to see a dark figure sweep past her and out of the world. That was the last one. After a year and a half of terror, the Axeman of New Orleans simply stopped. No arrest, no suspect, no ending. He walked out of Mike Pepitone's house and out of history. There is a coda, and it's the kind history offers when it wants to tease us. 2 years later and 2,000 miles away, on a Los Angeles street in December 1921, a widow shot a man named Joseph Mumfre dead on the sidewalk. The widow was Esther, Mike Pepitone's widow, who had remarried and moved west, and whose second husband had then mysteriously vanished. She swore to police that Mumfre was the Axeman of New Orleans, that he had murdered Mike in his bed, that she had recognized him. Mumfre was a genuine New Orleans criminal with a long, dark record, and for decades, crime writers sold him as the answer. But historians who actually pulled the records found the timeline doesn't cleanly fit. His stretches in and out of prison don't align with the attacks the way the legend claims. Esther served a few years and disappeared from the record. The tidy ending refuses to stay tidy. It always does. So who was he? A mafia enforcer running an extortion campaign against Italian grocers. Except extortionists don't butcher sleeping women and babies and write love letters to the press. A lone madman whose rage, the patterns suggest, was aimed above all at women. The grocery angle, just his hunting ground. Several men, copycats swimming in the panic, blurred by terrified witnesses into one shape in a slouch hat, or exactly what he told the city he was. Something that was never going to be caught, because it was never quite there. A century of researchers has pulled on every thread, and every thread comes loose in their hands. My great-grandmother didn't talk about any of that. What she remembered, what she made sure we remembered, was the music. Her father in the doorway, the shotgun, and the sound of an entire city refusing to die quietly, every horn in New Orleans lit up at once against the dark. To this day, when March 19th comes around, there are musicians in that city who mark the night, and I understand why. It is the only time in history a serial killer was stopped, for one single night, by jazz. But I think about the other side of it, the side she was too young to say out loud. Somewhere under all that glorious noise, on some gaslit street between the dance halls, a man stood alone in the dark, with his hands in his pockets, listening to a whole city play for him. And when the music finally stopped, just before dawn, he was still out there. He always was. A few years back, my wife and I took a last-minute trip to Key West. One of those spur-of-the-moment things where you book whatever's still available and hope for the best. What was still available was a room in a grand old Victorian guest house on Eaton Street, white as a wedding cake, with gingerbread trim. and a wraparound porch, and palms leaning over the fence like they were trying to listen in. The price was suspiciously reasonable for how beautiful it was. If you know Key West, you already know which house I'm talking about. We didn't. That's the whole point of this story. We checked into that house, knowing absolutely nothing, and I have thought about that ever since. How the strangest night of my life happened before I'd heard a single word of the legend. Which means nobody can tell me my mind invented it to match a story. The story came after. The night came first. The house had a turret. That was the detail my wife loved. An octagonal little tower rising off one corner, 2 stories up, with tall windows facing the street. The woman who checked us in was warm and funny, and gave us the kind of practiced tour innkeepers give, and I noticed. The way you notice things without noticing them. That she talked about the house strangely. Not about its plumbing or its history exactly. She'd say things like the house likes its quiet after midnight. And once, pointing up the staircase, she mentioned that we were in the room just below the turret. And then she paused, like there was a second half to that sentence, and didn't say it. There was a guest book on a table in the hall, one of those thick leather ones going back years. I flipped through it while my wife got ready for dinner. Most of it was the usual, lovely stay, wonderful breakfast. But every few pages, somebody had written something that didn't fit. Tell him we said hello. And once, in a child's careful print, we were very polite the whole time. We did what you do in Key West, Duval Street, conch fritters, a bar with a man playing guitar, and came back to the house late, a little sunburned, a little drunk, happy. The house at night was a different animal. Old Victorians talk. I know that. I grew up in one. Wood swells in island humidity, staircases tick as they cool, palm fronds scrape the gutters. I want to be fair about all of it, because being fair is the only way you'll believe me about the part where fairness ran out. We lay in the dark, under a slow ceiling fan, and the house muttered around us the way old houses do, and I was nearly asleep when I heard the footsteps. They were above us, directly above us, which meant the turret room. And here's what snapped my eyes open in the dark. They were wrong. Too light, too short. Not the footsteps of a grown adult crossing a floor, the quick, small, uneven rhythm of something the size of a child, moving from one side of the turret to the other. Then they stopped, and I lay there with my heart going, doing the math every one of you would do. Another guest, obviously, a kid up past bedtime in the room above. And I had nearly finished the math when the sound came again. Slower this time, crossing back, and stopping at what I judged to be the exact center of our ceiling, directly overhead. And then nothing, a long nothing, the kind of nothing that has weight, that feels less like an absence of sound, and more like something up there holding still. My wife slept, the fan turned. And at some point in that long nothing I heard, faint, and I will grant you it could have been the street. It could have been a night bird. It could have been anything. A small, soft run of giggling. 3 or 4 notes of it. Then the house went back to ticking, and eventually, somehow, I slept. At breakfast on the porch, I did the thing you do. Laughed it off, made it a joke. Kids upstairs had a big night, huh? I said to the innkeeper as she refilled our coffee. Above us, in the turret? And I watched something move across her face, fast, like a cloud shadow crossing a lawn. She set the pot down. There was nobody above you last night, she said. The turret room wasn't let. Off-season, midweek, you 2 were the only guests in the house. And then, after a moment in a lower voice, with the tone of someone finally saying the second half of the sentence from check-in, you don't know about this house, do you? So we sat on that porch in the morning sun, and she told us. In 1904, she said, this was the home of one of the island's wealthy families. the Ottos, and their little boy, Robert Eugene Otto, though everyone called him Gene, was given a doll, a big one, nearly the size of Gene himself, and here the innkeeper was careful in a way I respected. "The story people tell," she said, and it is a story, mind you, nobody wrote it down back then, is that the doll came from a Bahamian servant woman the family had treated badly. A woman who knew the old island folk magic, and that what she handed that little boy was a grudge with a face on it. "What isn't a story," she said, "is what the boy did. He named the doll Robert, his own first name, the name he never used, like he was handing half of himself over. He dressed it in his own little sailor suit. And from then on you didn't see one without the other. And the house, this house, got strange. His parents would stand at that boy's door," she said, nodding up toward the staircase, "and hear him talking to the doll, which is nothing. All children do that, except they swore they heard two voices, Gene's, and an answer, lower, different. Rooms in this house were found wrecked, other toys torn to pieces, furniture tipped, and every time the boy would be in the corner, pointing at the doll in the chair, saying the same three words. Robert did it. Neighbors. And this went on for decades," she said, "generations of them. Claimed that when the family was out, they'd see the doll move from window to window upstairs, watching the street from one room. Then, a few minutes later, from another. Gene grew up and left. Art school, New York, Paris, and became a painter, a good one. It's why they call this place the Artist House. He came home around 1930 with a wife, Anne, a pianist, and the two of them should have had a beautiful life here. Instead, Anne found out she'd married into something. Her grown husband went and got the doll of his childhood and gave it a room." She pointed straight up. "The turret. Furnished it with child-sized furniture. Sat Robert in the window facing the street, where school children swore for years that he watched them walk to class. Swore that some mornings he'd be gone from the glass and back again by afternoon. Anne hated it, wanted it boxed in the attic, gone, and in the quiet little war between the wife and the doll, everyone agrees who won. When anything went wrong in this house, right up until he was a gray-haired old man, Gene Otto had the same three words he'd had at 4 years old. Robert did it. Gene died in 1974, she said. Anne left the island and didn't live long after. And the doll stayed on with the house for a while. There's a famous story about a family that moved in afterward, and their 10-year-old daughter, who started saying almost immediately that the doll moved in the night, that she'd wake to find it at the foot of her bed, that it meant her harm, and who, by every account, is a grown woman now and has never once changed her story. Eventually, a later owner of this house, a woman named Myrtle, ended up keeping Robert for 20 years, and in 1994, she drove him across the island to the old fort, the Fort East Martello Museum, and handed him over, telling the staff, plain as weather, that the doll moved around her home on his own, and she was done. He's been in the fort ever since, and then the innkeeper picked the coffee pot back up and said, "The thing I have never been able to file away anywhere," said it lightly, like a fact about the plumbing. "The doll has been gone from this house for 30 years, and guests still hear him in the turret." We went to the fort that afternoon. Of course we did. You would have too. It's a real Civil War fortress on the edge of the island. Brick archways and thick, cool walls that hold the dark like a cellar. And in one gallery, there's a glass case with a small crowd around it, and in the case, there is Robert. He's bigger than you expect, over 3 feet, a real child's size. In that faded sailor suit, gone the color of old newspaper, his face worn by a century of tropical air until the painted features have almost surrendered. A blur where the mouth was, 2 small, dark pinprick eyes that do not shine. In his lap he holds a little toy lion, the way a child holds a thing it owns, and the crowd around him behaves like no museum crowd you've ever seen. They greet him, out loud. A man asked permission before raising his phone, asked, and then waited, listening for something, and only then took the picture. Because those are the rules, the docent told us, with a smile that never fully committed to being a joke. Say hello when you come in, ask before you photograph him, and never, ever mock him. Then she showed us the letters, and I understood the whole thing at once. Near his case, the museum displays them, a wall of letters, hundreds of them, from Texas and Germany and Japan, and everywhere else, and nearly everyone follows the same arc. I visited. I thought it was silly. I laughed, or I took his picture without asking. And since I got home, the crash, the diagnosis, the divorce, the lost job, the flooded house, the year that will not stop going wrong, and then always the same ending, written by grown adults, soldiers, nurses, skeptics. I'm sorry, Robert. I believe now. Please make it stop. The most reported strangeness in the whole museum, the docent said, is technology. Cameras that work perfectly all day, refusing to fire in front of his case, phones at full charge dying in a visitor's hand. I asked her, casually, like it didn't matter, about the artist house, about the sounds people report in a turret the doll hasn't lived in for 30 years. She just gave me that uncommitted smile and said, some houses take a long time to get used to being empty. Now, I promised you grounded, so let me hand you every out I know, because I've spent years collecting them for myself. Researchers who have traced Robert's actual paper trail say the likeliest origin has no curse in it at all. The doll appears to have been made by the Steiff Company of Germany, the famous teddy bear makers, and was likely bought by Jean's grandfather on a trip abroad, possibly a piece designed for a shop display rather than a child, which would explain those unsettling, not quite child proportions. The vengeful servant, the folk magic, none of it appears in any record from the time. It's a story that grew on the doll, the way barnacles grow on a hull, and the Killer Doll movies he inspired. He's widely credited as an ancestor of Chucky himself. Added their own coat of paint. Old Victorians tick and settle. Empty turrets collect stories the way they collect heat. And nobody writes to a museum when their trip home goes fine. You only write the letter when you need somewhere to put the bad year. I know all of this. I have recited all of this to myself, in the dark, more than once. But here is where all my outs run out, and why I'm telling you this at all. Every explanation I own explains the legend. Not one of them explains my night. The story came after, remember that. I heard those small footsteps cross the turret floor and stop above my bed, and I heard that soft run of giggling hours before I knew there was anything to imagine. There were no other guests. There was no child. There has been no doll in that house since 1994. On our last evening, we walked past the artist house at dusk, and I stopped on the far sidewalk, the side the school children used to cross to, and looked up at the turret windows, and I stood there far longer than I meant to, waiting for the glass to be not empty. It stayed empty. Somehow that was worse. For the record, at the fort, I asked Robert's permission before I took his picture. Out loud in front of strangers, feeling like a fool. The photo came out fine. We flew home fine. Our year was fine. I don't believe in cursed dolls. I need you to understand that I don't. But some nights, in my own house, half asleep, I'll hear some small sound from the floor above, and I'm instantly wide awake, lying very still, counting footsteps that aren't there, waiting out a long nothing that has weight. And if you ever find yourself in Key West, in that cool brick gallery, in front of that glass, I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm just telling you what it costs to be polite. Almost nothing. Ask him nicely.